He picked up his son's clip-on tie, straightened it once, and then walked straight into a wedding he never wanted to attend. Commander James Calloway, 12 years Navy, 2 tours overseas. One dead wife didn't flinch when the whole reception turned to look at him. He didn't flinch when his sister hugged him too hard, or when the band played the song from his own wedding, or when his 8-year-old son asked, "Dad, are you sad?" He just said, "No, buddy, I'm fine." He wasn't fine. And then a woman in a green dress looked at him from across the room and said something no one had dared say to him in 3 years. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe. This one's going the distance. James Calloway tied his son's tie 3 times before he got it right. The first attempt was too loose. The second was crooked. The third, he pulled it just a half-inch too tight, and his son Danny made a face like he was being strangled by a very formal snake. "Dad! Hold still. It's choking me. It's a tie. It's supposed to feel like that." "Why?" James looked at his 8-year-old big brown eyes. His mother's nose, that same expression she used to make when she thought he was being stubborn, and he didn't have a good answer for that. He never did with Danny. The kid asked questions that didn't have clean answers. "Because that's how ties work," James said finally. "And we're going to Aunt Claire's wedding, and you're going to look like a gentleman." Danny looked down at his clip-on tie. His small chest puffed under the button-down shirt James had ironed the night before. He considered this. Do gentlemen have to eat food they don't like? Yes. Even shrimp, especially shrimp. Danny groaned like this was the worst news he'd ever received. James almost smiled. Almost. He caught it before it got too far, the way a man catches a door before it swings all the way open. He turned away, picked up his jacket from the chair, and checked himself in the bathroom mirror. He looked fine. He always looked fine. Gray suit, not the navy dress whites, because this wasn't that kind of event. And honestly, wearing the dress whites would feel like carrying a flag into a place where no one understood what it stood for. Dark tie. His hair was shorter now than when he was active, but still military. You never really shook the haircut. His face was 41 years old, jaw set, eyes clear. He looked like a man who had things together. No one looking at him would know. That was the point. The drive to the Hargrove estate took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of Danny asking questions about why people get married, whether animals get married, whether sharks would get married if they could, and whether James would ever get married again. James answered the first 3 with varying degrees of patience. The fourth one, he didn't answer at all. He just changed the radio station. Danny, being Danny, noticed. He always noticed things. He had his mother's radar for the things James didn't say. "Uncle Pete says you should start dating again," Danny offered from the back seat in the careful voice of someone relaying intelligence. "Uncle Pete talks too much. He says you're closing yourself off from the world." Danny said this in a deeper voice, clearly imitating Pete's drawl. "He's wrong. He also says Aunt Claire's friend from college is going to be at the wedding, and she's very nice, and maybe—" "Danny?" "Yeah. Look out the window. There's nothing out there." "Look anyway." Danny pressed his face against the glass. A beat of silence. Then, "Dad, I see a cow." "Great. Tell me about the cow." "It's just standing there." "What's it doing?" "Nothing. It's a cow." "Sounds peaceful." Danny laughed a sudden bright laugh that filled the whole car. And James felt it hit him somewhere behind the sternum, the way his son's laugh always did. Like a key turning in a lock he'd been keeping bolted shut. He kept his eyes on the road. The Hargrove estate sat at the edge of Mirror Lake, an hour outside Chicago. The kind of property that had been in someone's family long enough that the money was invisible inside it. Old trees, white tents, string lights that would come alive at dusk. Valets in vests who looked like they'd been hired specifically to make men like James feel underdressed even in a good suit. There were maybe 200 guests already moving across the lawn when James pulled up. He handed his keys to a valet, who who couldn't have been older than 20, and stood for a moment at the edge of all of it watching. Families, couples, people who laughed too loud at things that weren't that funny because they were happy, and happiness made you generous with your laughter. An older couple dancing near the edge of the tent, not because the music had started, but just because they felt like it. A man lifting a small girl onto his shoulders so she could see over the crowd. James watched the man with the girl on his shoulders. He used to do that with Danny. Still did sometimes, though Danny was getting heavy for it now. "Dad?" Danny appeared beside him, tugging his sleeve. "Can I have shrimp?" "I thought you hated shrimp." "I changed my mind. I want to try hating them in person." This time James did smile. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Come on," he said. "Let's find Aunt Claire." Claire Calloway. Now after today, Claire Hargrove found them first. She came through the crowd at speed in her full wedding gown with her hair up and her eyes already bright with the particular electricity of a woman who'd been planning this day for 14 months and could not believe it was finally happening. She hugged Danny first, which was the right call. Danny lit up. Then she turned to James, and the way she looked at him with that sister look that carried 36 years of shared history in it almost undid him right there on the lawn. "You came," she said. "You invited me. I invite you to everything. You usually find a reason not to." Danny wanted to try the shrimp. Claire laughed, but her eyes stayed serious. She held his face in both her hands. She'd always done this even when they were kids, like she needed to make sure he was really there. "You look good, James." "I look like a man in a suit." "You look like my brother." She kissed his cheek. "Stay. Don't disappear after the ceremony. Promise me." He didn't want to promise. Promising meant staying, and staying meant sitting inside all of this, all the noise and the joy and the couples and the dancing for hours, when every instinct he had was calibrated toward exit strategy. But Claire's eyes were doing that thing they did, and Danny was looking up at him. "I'll stay," he said. Claire smiled like she didn't quite believe him. Smart woman. The ceremony was short and clean, the way James liked things. The groom, Todd Hargrove, a large red-faced man who'd built a regional logistics company and was relentlessly decent about it, cried when he saw Claire walk down the aisle. Not performatively. Just his face crumpled, and he pressed his lips together, and his eyes went wet, and he didn't look away from her for a single second. James watched that and felt something move in his chest. He remembered standing at the end of an aisle. He remembered watching the doors. He remembered the moment Kate appeared, the small shock of her, even after knowing her for 6 years, even after already knowing she would be beautiful, and the way his whole body had gone quiet like every restless frequency in him suddenly found signal. He remembered thinking, "I don't deserve this, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying." He was 31 then. Kate was 29. Danny wasn't born yet. The future was just open. Wide and open and full of time. He hadn't known. You never knew. James blinked. The ceremony was ending. Todd was kissing Claire. The crowd was applauding. Danny beside him was clapping with both hands raised above his head, because he thought applause was more effective if your hands were higher than everyone else's. James put his arm around his son's shoulders and stood there in the noise, and behind his eyes was a silence so deep it had its own geography. The reception was everything he expected it to be. Music, an open bar, 100 conversations happening in the spaces between tables. Danny found 2 other kids within 15 minutes and disappeared with them in the direction of the dessert table, which James accepted as the natural order of things. He found a chair at the edge of the tent near the boundary where the light got thinner, and the sound of the crowd blurred into a general warmth, and he sat down. He didn't get a drink. He didn't want a drink. Not really. Not when he was the only parent here for Danny. Not when he needed to be sharp enough to drive home at the end of the night. He just sat there and watched. His brother-in-law Pete found him within 10 minutes, which was a record even for Pete, who had a sixth sense for locating James at events and attempting to socially resuscitate him. Pete was 53 broad with a beard he'd grown after his divorce, and then kept because his girlfriend liked it. He sat down beside James with 2 glasses of something amber and held one out. James shook his head. Pete set it on the table anyway. "Just in case you change your mind." "I won't." "You're doing the wall thing again." "I'm sitting at a table." "The wall thing is a posture, James. It's not about where you are. It's—" Pete gestured at all of him. "This. The way you're sitting like you're on guard duty." "Old habit." Pete leaned back, looked out at the crowd. "She's really happy." "Claire, yeah? Todd's a good man." "He cried at the altar." "That's how you know." Pete let a beat pass. "You cried at yours too." James said nothing. Pete let the silence sit for a moment before pressing on, because Pete always pressed on. It was his defining quality, and also his most exhausting one. "His cousin is here. Todd's cousin, Erin. She's a landscape architect, just got out of a long relationship. She's—" "Pete." "I'm just saying she's—" "Pete." James turned and looked at him. Not hard, not angry, just clear. The way he'd learned to be clear in 12 years of giving orders in conditions where ambiguity cost lives. "I appreciate what you're trying to do. I know it comes from a good place, but I'm not here for that." Pete looked at him for a long moment. "Then why are you here, James?" James thought about it. "Because Claire asked me to come." "That's the only reason." "Yes." Pete picked up his own drink, stared at it. "She'd want you to be happy, Kate. She'd want—" "I know what Kate would want." James said it quietly, and something in his voice must have landed differently than usual because Pete stopped. Just stopped. Nodded once. Looked away. They sat together for a while without talking, which was, James thought, the most useful Pete had been all day. Danny came back 3 times. Once for money for the photo booth. Once to show James a piece of cake the size of his head, which he ate in its entirety. Once to ask with great seriousness whether it was okay to slow dance if you didn't know how. James told him that not knowing how was the whole point, and Danny took this guidance at face value and disappeared again. The afternoon folded into evening. The string lights came on. The music shifted slower now, the band easing into the kind of songs that pulled couples to their feet and left single people very aware of their own hands. James had moved at some point from the chair at the reception to a standing position near the far edge of the tent, closer to the water, where the crowd thinned enough that he could breathe without pretending. The lake at this hour was the color of hammered pewter. A dock extended maybe 50 feet out. No one was using it. James stood with his back half turned to the party watching the water, instead of the people counting the lights, reflecting on the surface, the way he used to count stars off the deck of a ship at 0200, when the night watch was quiet, and there was nothing to do but think. He was thinking about leaving. He'd promised Claire he'd stay, but he'd been here 4 hours and Danny was starting to run on dessert fumes, and every minute longer felt like something that cost him. He was calculating the exit fine Danny say goodbye to Claire, and Todd retrieved the car 40 minutes home. Danny asleep in the back seat by the time they hit the highway, when he heard a voice behind him. "You've been standing here for 45 minutes. He turned around. The woman was about 10 feet away, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched in a green dress that wasn't trying to be noticed, but was succeeding anyway. She was somewhere in her late 30s, sharp, composed, with dark eyes that were looking at him not with curiosity exactly, but with the particular attention of someone who observes carefully before they speak. He hadn't noticed her before. He'd been watching the crowd and somehow missed her, which meant she was good at occupying space without demanding it. "I'm sorry," James said. 45 minutes, she repeated. "I've been at that table." She nodded toward a table a short distance away. "And you've been standing here the whole time. Alone. Which is either very peaceful or very painful, and I can't tell which." He looked at her. "You've been watching me for 45 minutes. I've been watching the whole room. You were part of the room." A pause. "You're harder to ignore than you're trying to be." That was unexpected enough that James didn't have an immediate answer, which almost never happened. He was not a man who ran out of words. He'd briefed senior officers, he'd negotiated port access with harbor authorities in 3 languages, he'd told a 22-year-old sailor that his brother had died and somehow found the words for that. He didn't run out of words. "I'm James," he said. "Victoria." She didn't offer her hand, just her name, and something about that was more direct than a handshake. "Who are you to the bride or groom?" "Bride. She's my sister." Victoria nodded, looked toward the tent where Claire was visible laughing with a group of women. "She seems extraordinary." "She is." He paused. I went to business school with Todd's sister. I've met him maybe 4 times." She tilted her glass slightly. "I almost didn't come. Why did you—" She looked at him with those dark, considering eyes. "Same reason you did, probably." She let that sit there. Someone who mattered asked. He felt something shift very slightly in the locked geography behind his ribs. Not open, nothing opened, but something shifted. "You said I was hard to ignore," James said. "What does that mean?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, not evasive, considering. "It means you're doing something very specific," she said finally. "You're at a wedding surrounded by people who are all trying to feel things, and you are working very, very hard not to feel anything at all. And that kind of effort—" She looked at him steadily. "It has a weight to it. It changes the air around a person." James stared at her. No one had said anything like that to him in 3 years. Not Pete, not Claire, not the therapist the Navy had recommended after Kate died, and he'd attended exactly twice before deciding he had things under control. No stranger had ever walked up to him at a social event and said something this accurate with this little preamble. "That's a very direct thing to say to someone you've never met," he said. "I know." She wasn't apologetic. "I could say something easier. I'm just not very good at easier." "Neither am I." She smiled then, not large, not performed, just a small and real thing in the corner of her mouth. "I didn't think you were." From somewhere behind him across the reception, Danny's voice cut through the music. "Dad! Dad, they're doing the cake! Dad, come on!" James turned, saw his son waving both arms from 100 feet away, with the energy of someone trying to flag down an aircraft carrier, and turned back to Victoria. "That's mine," he said. She glanced toward Danny, then back at James, and something in her expression changed, not softer exactly, but more attentive, recalibrating. "Go," she said. He took a step, then stopped. He didn't know why. Some instinct that had been buried under 3 years of careful numbness. "He's 8, James said. "His name is Danny. His mother died 3 years ago, and he asks about sharks more than anyone I've ever met, and I'm—" He stopped, tried to figure out what he was trying to say. "He's the reason I came." Victoria looked at him with those clear dark eyes. "He sounds like someone worth showing up for," she said quietly. James Calloway, former Navy commander, widower, single father. A man who had not let anyone pass the first layer of himself in 3 years, nodded once, and then he walked back toward his son and the light. He didn't go back and find her that night. He told himself it was because Danny needed to get home, which was true. He told himself he wasn't the kind of man who went back, which was also true, or had been true, for a long time. But on the drive home, with Danny asleep in the back seat exactly as predicted, James drove through 40 minutes of dark highway and thought about the way she had said it. "You're working very, very hard not to feel anything at all." He thought about Todd crying at the altar. He thought about the old couple dancing before the music started. He thought about Danny's laugh filling the car on the way up, loud and easy and unguarded, in the way that only children and people who hadn't learned to be careful could manage. He thought about a green dress at the edge of the party and dark eyes that looked at him like they were actually interested in what they found. He merged onto the highway. He pressed his lips together. He drove home in the dark and did not let himself feel anything. But for the first time in 3 years, the lock on that door had moved. Just slightly, just enough. He didn't sleep well. He hadn't slept well in 3 years, so that wasn't new. But that night it was different. not the usual hollow darkness where he lay staring at the ceiling, counting the things he hadn't done. The calls he hadn't returned, the school forms he'd forgotten to sign. That night, his mind kept returning to a specific moment, replaying it the way a tongue finds a loose tooth, not because it hurt exactly, but because something was different there, and the body needed to keep checking. You're working very, very hard not to feel anything at all. He got up at 5:14 a.m., which was when he always got up because the Navy had wired his internal clock in a way that 3 years of civilian life hadn't touched. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, looking out at the backyard, the yard he'd been meaning to fix up since they moved into this house 2 years ago, the one with the broken gate latch and the section of fence that leaned and the garden bed that Kate would have planted something in by now, but which James had left as bare earth because starting it felt like a decision he wasn't ready to make. He drank his coffee standing up. He did not think about green dresses. He thought about the fence latch. He was very focused on the fence latch. Danny came down at 7:15 in his pajamas and socks that didn't match, carrying the stuffed penguin he still slept with, but would deny owning if anyone outside the house mentioned it. He climbed onto the kitchen stool, propped his chin in both hands, and looked at his father with the directness that children have before they learn it makes adults uncomfortable. "You look tired," Danny said. "Good morning to you too. Did you sleep?" "Some. You always say some." Danny slid the penguin onto the counter and regarded it. "Miss Patterson says when you say some about sleep, it usually means no. Miss Patterson is your third-grade teacher. She's not a doctor. She says a lot of true things, though." James set a bowl of cereal in front of his son and sat down across from him. Danny ate with the systematic focus of a small person who considered breakfast a task to be completed, not a social occasion. James drank his second cup of coffee and thought about the fence. "Dad," Danny said between bites. "Yeah." "That lady last night, at the wedding." James went still. He kept his expression neutral. "Which lady?" Danny gave him a look that communicated clearly and efficiently that he was 8 and not stupid. "The one in the green dress. You talked to her for a while." "A few minutes. I saw you. From the cake table." Danny pointed his spoon briefly at the middle distance, as if locating the memory. "You were doing the talking face." "I have a talking face." "You have different faces, Dad. There's the driving face and the phone call face and the face you make when Pete says something dumb. That one's my favorite. And then there's the talking face, where you're actually like in the conversation." Danny paused, chewing. "You don't do the talking face that much." James looked at his son. The kid had Kate's instincts, full stop. The whole package. "She seemed interesting," James said finally. "Was she nice?" "She was honest." He paused. "Which is better than nice usually." Danny considered this with great seriousness, the way he considered anything that felt like a rule about the world. "Is that why you look weird this morning?" "I don't look weird." "You look like you're thinking about something and trying not to think about it at the same time." James put his coffee cup down, breathed out. "Eat your cereal, Danny." Danny ate his cereal, but he did it with the faint, satisfied expression of someone who had made their point and was comfortable letting it stand. James called Claire at 9 o'clock. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was awake and had been waiting for it because Claire knew him. "Good morning," she said, and he could hear Todd's voice in the background and the specific warmth in the way Claire said something back that wasn't for James, the private language of two people who had just had the best day of their lives and were still inside it. "You sound happy," James said. "I am happy. I'm extraordinarily, stupidly happy. It's disgusting." A pause. "How are you?" "Fine." "James." "I mean it. Fine." Another pause. Claire was choosing her words. She'd always done this thought carefully before she pushed, which was what made her pushing bearable. "You stayed," she said. "I noticed you stayed." "I said I would. You say a lot of things." She said it without heat, just truth. "Thank you, really." It was a good wedding. Todd cried. I know, I saw. He cried before I even made it to the altar. He saw me through the door and just... Claire stopped, and he could hear the smile in the silence. I didn't expect it. It broke me open, James, in the best way. Is that a ridiculous thing to say? No, James said, and he meant it. A beat. Then Claire carefully, did you talk to anyone? Enjoy yourself even a little. I talked to Pete. Pete doesn't count. Pete is furniture at this point. She waited. Anyone else? James looked out the kitchen window at the leaning fence. Someone named Victoria. Todd's connection, I think. Business school friend of his sister. The pause that followed was a half-second too long to be casual. Victoria Hart. She didn't give a last name. Dark hair, green dress. About this tall. Claire made a gesture James couldn't see over the phone. Very composed, kind of still in the middle of a crowd like she's... Yeah, James said. That's her. Another pause longer. You talked to Victoria Hart. Why do you say it like that? Because... Claire stopped. Started again. She doesn't usually do that. Talk to people she doesn't know. At events. She's very private. Everyone at the table was trying to pull her into conversation, and she was perfectly polite and perfectly distant the whole night. A beat. And she went and talked to you. She said I was hard to ignore. The silence on Claire's end stretched out long enough that James could hear Todd laughing at something in another room, and then Claire said very quietly, Huh. What? Nothing. Nothing, She stopped again. I like her, James. I've met her twice, and I genuinely like her. She's one of those people who's very rare. She's... A pause. Just be careful. He frowned. What does that mean? It means she's a real person with real things going on, and so are you, and I don't want either of you to... I don't know. I'm being overprotective. Ignore me. It's my wedding day. I'm allowed to be weird. It was one conversation, James said. Sure, Claire said. And then, okay, sure. He said goodbye. He hung up. He stood at the window for another full minute. He was very focused on the fence. He didn't see her for 11 days. He worked. He took Danny to school and picked him up and helped with homework and made dinner and did the dishes and handled the leaking pipe under the bathroom sink by himself. Because he refused to pay someone $300 for something he could figure out on YouTube, which took 4 hours and one ruined shirt, but ultimately worked. He returned calls from his business partner Leon about the mixed-use development project on the north side that had stalled for 6 weeks waiting on a zoning decision. He went to the hardware store and bought the parts for the fence latch and fixed it on a Saturday morning while Danny sat on the back steps and narrated his progress like a sports commentator. He did not look up Victoria Hart. He thought about it twice and decided against it both times because looking someone up based on a single conversation at a wedding was something a certain kind of man did, and James was not that kind of man, or had not been. He wasn't entirely sure anymore what kind of man he was, which was its own problem. He lived his life. Tight, organized, deliberate. It was a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the wedding, when he walked into the coffee shop on Meridian Street that he'd been going to for 2 years because it was 3 blocks from his office and opened at 6 and didn't play music until after 7. He ordered his usual. He moved to wait at the end of the counter, and then he heard a voice say behind him, "You take it black." He turned around. She was there, no green dress this time, just a dark jacket and a white shirt, and the same quality of composure, the same way of standing in space, like she'd decided where she was and was comfortable with the decision. Her hair was down. She was holding her phone in one hand and looking at him with those steady dark eyes, and there was no surprise in her expression, which either meant she was very controlled or she'd already processed the coincidence before he'd turned around. "You were watching," James said. Observational habit. She glanced at the counter. "You ordered before you even looked at the menu. You already knew what you wanted. Black coffee. No hesitation." A small lift at the corner of her mouth. Military. Was it that obvious? The way you scanned the room when you walked in. Exit points first, then the counter, then the other customers. It's a specific order. She stepped up as the barista called her name, collected a black coffee of her own, and turned back to him. Navy, I'd guess. Marines order differently. He stared at her. How do Marines order? Like they're daring the barista to get it wrong. She held up her cup slightly. 11 days. What? Since the wedding. 11 days. She said it the way someone states a fact, not an accusation. I wasn't sure if you'd gone back to find me. After the cake. I didn't. I know. She held his gaze. Why not? James looked at her, at the directness of the question, at the complete absence of game in the way she asked it. No angle. No performance. Just the question. Because I'm not, I don't do that, he said. I don't go back. For anyone, not in a long time. She nodded slowly, like she was filing this information carefully. The little boy. Danny. He seemed like a great kid. He is. Something eased in James's voice without him meaning it to. He informed me this morning that penguins are the only birds that can't fly, but also don't seem to mind, and that this makes them either very wise or very unbothered, and he hasn't decided which yet. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed, a real one, unguarded, not the polished version of a laugh that people in positions of authority sometimes produced as social currency. This was genuine. It changed her whole face. That's a good theory, she said. He has a lot of them. She looked down at her coffee, then back up. I have a 9 o'clock, but... She paused, and something passed across her face that might have been calculation, or might have been something more like resolve. Could we sit 20 minutes? I have 20 minutes. James thought about Leon waiting at the office. He thought about the zoning report he needed to review before the afternoon call. He thought about all the reasonable things he had to do and the clean, manageable shape of the day he'd planned. Yeah, he said. I can do 20. They sat at a corner table, the kind with 2 chairs angled toward each other, rather than across, which felt like an accident of furniture arrangement, but made the conversation feel more like conversation and less like an interview. She had both hands around her coffee cup. He had one hand on the table and one in his lap. They talked about the wedding first, Todd and Claire, how good they seemed together, how rare that was. Easy. Warm-up material. Then Victoria said, What do you do architecturally? What kind of work? He looked at her. How did you know I was an architect? Claire mentioned it. We ended up talking for a bit after you left. She met his eyes steadily. I hope that doesn't feel like research. Does it matter if it does? She considered. Probably not. I looked you up. Your firm. Callaway Dean Design. Mixed use and adaptive reuse mostly. You've done good work. You looked up my firm. I research people I find interesting. It's a business habit I haven't managed to separate from the rest of my life. No apology. No softening. Just the statement. Is that a problem? James looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the 11 days. He thought about standing at the window looking at the fence. He thought about what Claire had said. She doesn't usually do that, talk to people she doesn't know, and the specific way his sister had said it. No, he said. It's not a problem. Victoria nodded, took a sip of her coffee, set it down. I run a development company, Hart Capital Ventures. We're mid-size, not the biggest in the room, but we own what we choose carefully. A pause. What I'm interested in is adaptive reuse, taking spaces that have been written off and finding what they can become. I know the work, James said. I've followed a few of the projects. The warehouse conversion on the west side, the Delmar building. She looked at him with something that might have been surprise quickly contained. You know that project. It was referenced in an urban planning seminar I attended last year. Whoever designed the interior structural decisions. That was in-house, she said. And controversial. Half my team thought we were overcorrecting on the open floor retention. The other half thought we didn't go far enough. Who was right? The building was right. She said it simply. The building knew what it wanted to be. You just had to stop imposing your idea on it and start listening. James set his cup down. He was looking at her the way he looked at structural plans when something clicked into alignment. That's how you approach it. You listen to the building. I know how it sounds. It sounds like what I do. He paused. Or what I used to do before I spent 3 years doing work that was... He stopped. Safe, she offered. He looked at her. Yeah, safe. She didn't rush in to fill the space he'd left. She waited, and the patience of it had a quality he recognized. It was the patience of someone who'd learned the hard way that the thing worth hearing doesn't come out until the space is clear. My wife died 3 years ago, James said. He said it the way he always said it when it had to be said straight, no setup, because there was no good way to build to it, and trying felt dishonest. Aneurysm. She was 37. No warning. There in the morning, gone in the afternoon. Victoria's hands stilled on her coffee cup. After that, I took everything I used to do. The ambitious work, the projects that scared me a little, the ones with real risk, and I just... He made a small gesture. Put them down. Took on work I could control. Work that couldn't surprise me. That makes sense, she said quietly. Not, I'm so sorry. Not that must have been so hard. Not the usual phrases that were kind and accurate and somehow still landed sideways. Just that makes sense. Like she was following the logic of him. Does it? He said. When you lose something catastrophically. Victoria said, the rational response is to reduce your exposure to catastrophe. Narrow your range. Control what you can control. She looked at her coffee. I understand that response. Personally. A pause. My fiancé died 6 years ago. Heart condition no one knew about. He was 34. She said it with the same directness he'd used, clean, no preamble, because she'd also learned that there was no good way around it, and trying made it worse. We were 8 weeks from the wedding. James looked at her. So yes, she said. Personally. The coffee shop moved around them. The sound of the espresso machine. Someone's phone call. The door opening and closing as the morning crowd moved through. Neither of them was inside any of it. They were in their own separate quiet, sitting across from each other in it. What did you do? James asked. After. I worked. She said it without irony, just statement. I built things. I took everything I would have put into a life, and I put it into the company, which was very effective professionally. A beat. Less so in other ways. Yeah. I got very good at rooms full of people, she said, at being impressive and unreachable at the same time. There's a skill to it, staying close enough that no one notices you're gone. She paused. I noticed you doing it at the wedding. That's why I went over. Because you recognized it. Because I was doing it too, and then you were there doing it, and I thought... She stopped. A rare thing he was beginning to understand, Victoria Hart stopping mid-sentence. I thought it would be a shame if we both stood at the edge of that beautiful, terrible party and didn't at least say something true to each other. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I almost left before the reception. I know. I watched you calculate it, and you still came over. I figured I had about a 3-minute window. A slight smile. You move fast when you've decided. Former Navy. I know. He looked at her, at the steadiness of her, the way she met everything directly, the way she said hard things without making them heavier than they needed to be. He thought about what Claire had said. She's one of those people who's very rare. The barista called something from across the counter. Victoria glanced at her watch, then back at him. 9 o'clock, she said. Yeah. She stood, picked up her coffee and her jacket. Paused. Looked at him with those dark, clear eyes. I have a project I'm working through. A building on the south side, old industrial mid-century. The bones are extraordinary, but it's been sitting empty for 9 years, and everyone I've talked to wants to flatten it. She paused. I don't want to flatten it. James felt something move in him. Not a feeling exactly more like the first movement of a thing that had been still for a long time. "What kind of building?" "Come see it," she said. "If you want." "No obligation. I'm walking through it Friday afternoon." She tilted her head, the small, precise movement of someone making a decision. "You can tell me what you think the building wants to be." She said it back to him exactly what the building wants to be, and something in the way she did it wasn't a test. It was an invitation. He thought about the zoning report. He thought about Leon. He thought about the safe, controllable shape of his week. "Friday," he said. 2:00. "Where?" she told him. He knew the street south of the Loop, the part of the city that the development money hadn't reached yet. All cracked sidewalks and loading doors and buildings with stories that nobody was telling anymore. She left. He watched her go, the same composed way of moving he'd noticed at the wedding, purposeful without urgency. She pushed through the door and was gone into the morning. James sat alone at the corner table for another few minutes. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't think about the zoning report. He thought about a building that had been sitting empty for 9 years and what it might be trying to become. He thought about the way Victoria Hart had said, "I think it would be a shame if we both stood at the edge of that beautiful, terrible party and didn't at least say something true." He thought about the lock that had moved just slightly, just barely on the drive home 11 days ago. He picked up his coffee and drank the last of it. He was going to be late to the office. For the first time in a long time, he was okay with that. Leon called on Thursday afternoon while James was reviewing structural load calculations at his desk, and the first thing he said was, "You're going somewhere tomorrow at 2, and you didn't put it on the shared calendar." James looked up from his drawings. "How do you know that?" "Because you cleared your Friday afternoon, and you never clear Friday afternoon. Friday afternoon is when you do the billing review that you hate and reschedule every week but still do." A pause. "So either you finally snapped and you're going fishing or something happened." Leon Dean had been James's business partner for 6 years, his friend for 8, and his most reliable source of accurate personal feedback since Pete's divorce, had made Pete unreliable on account of excessive projecting. Leon was 55, bald by choice, and had the particular gift of being almost completely impossible to lie to. Not because he was aggressive about truth, but because he simply assumed you'd tell him and waited with great patience until you did. "I'm looking at a building," James said. "Whose building?" "Victoria Hart. Hart Capital Ventures." The silence on Leon's end lasted exactly long enough for James to know that Leon also knew who Victoria Hart was. "The adaptive reuse woman," Leon said finally. "Yeah." "The Delmar building, the warehouse conversion on the west side." "You know her work." "I know her work," Leon said. "I've been trying to get a meeting with her firm for 2 years. They don't take unsolicited pitches." A pause. "How did you meet her?" "Claire's wedding." Another silence. Longer this time. "James?" "It's a building walkthrough. She wants a second opinion on a South Side industrial property." "I know what you're describing. I'm asking a different question." James set down his pencil. "Leon, I'm just saying, Victoria Hart doesn't ask for second opinions. Not from people she doesn't know." A careful beat. "She must think you're worth something. She thinks the building is worth something. She wants someone who agrees with her before she has to fight her board about it." "Maybe," Leon said. "Or maybe she just wanted to see you again." He said it without weight, without implication, just stated it the way he stated most things, like it was a reasonable fact, and he was curious what James would do with it. "You've had that look this week. The thinking look, not the design thinking look, the other one. The one where you're in your own head about something that isn't a building." James said nothing. "Take photos," Leon said. "If the bones are good, I want to know." He hung up without waiting for a response, which was a Leon specialty. James sat at his desk for a while after looking at the load calculations without seeing them. He was aware that he'd cleared Friday afternoon 3 days ago, when he'd gotten back to the office after the coffee shop, before he'd made a conscious decision about whether he was going, and without telling anyone, which meant some part of him had decided before he did. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He went back to the calculations. He felt the familiar architecture of the work, clean, precise load-bearing, and understood, without putting it in those terms, that he'd been living inside that precision for 3 years, because it was the one space where nothing could surprise him. On the drive home, Danny asked him why he was quiet. "Thinking," James said, "about the building." James glanced in the rearview mirror. "How did you know about a building?" "I didn't," Danny said, looking out the window. "But now I do." Friday at 1:45, James parked on a south side street that still had its original brick pavers showing through cracks in the asphalt, got out of the truck, and looked at the building. It was 4 stories, cast iron and heavy timber, mid-century industrial, the kind of construction that happened before. Cost-cutting changed what buildings were made of. The windows were boarded, but the frames were intact. The facade had 20 years of grime on it, but underneath that, if you knew how to look, you could see the lines of a building that had been built to last and had kept that promise, even after everyone stopped asking it to. It had been a textile manufacturing plant from the look of it. The loading dock on the side was original. The iron columns visible through the ground floor windows were genuine, not decorative load-bearing, all the way to the roof. He was photographing the foundation detail at the corner when he heard footsteps on the pavement behind him, unhurried, precise. "You're early," Victoria said. "Habit." He turned. Same composed quality as always, dark coat. This time a leather portfolio under one arm, her hair pulled back. She looked at the building the way he did, not at the surface, but through it. I'm always early." She came to stand beside him, following his line of sight. "What do you think?" "I think whoever boarded those windows was being lazy. The frames are good." "They are." She tilted her head up at the facade. "My board says tear it down and build new. The land value justifies a 30-story residential tower." "And you?" "And I think that's the most boring possible answer to an interesting question." She glanced at him. "Shall we go in?" She had the key, an actual key, old brass, which meant she'd already dealt with whatever ownership structure had been sitting on this property for 9 years. That was its own kind of answer about how serious she was. The interior stopped him in the doorway. The ceiling height alone 18 feet on the ground floor, with the original timber beams running the full-width clear span. No intermediate columns breaking the space. Iron-framed windows that ran floor to ceiling on the south wall, boarded now but structurally intact. A mezzanine level on the east side, steel and timber solid. The concrete floor had cracked in places, but the slab was thick poured when concrete was poured to mean something. James walked in slowly, the way he always walked into a building for the first time. Not looking for problems, looking for the thing the building was trying to tell him. He ran his hand along one of the iron columns. Cold, smooth, the kind of smooth that only came from decades of air moving across metal in an enclosed space. He looked up at the connection where the column met the beam. Original hardware. Full bearing. Nothing sistered. Nothing reinforced, nothing that suggested anyone had ever doubted the building's structural integrity. "The bones," he said mostly to himself. "I told you." Victoria was standing a few feet back, watching him move through the space. She wasn't directing him. She was watching to see what he found. This column grid, what's the spacing? 12 feet 14. The original manufacturing floor needed clearance for the equipment. They overbuild the structure to accommodate future reconfiguration. Smart. He moved toward the center of the floor, turned, looked back toward the entry. "The light from the south wall, if you take the boards off those windows, this whole floor is flooded in the afternoon. It's..." He stopped. "What?" "It's a market," he said. It came out before he'd fully worked through it. "Not a food market. An artisan market, workshop spaces, maker studios on the upper floors, a permanent market hall on the ground floor. The mezzanine becomes..." He crossed to the east side, looked up at the mezzanine. "The mezzanine is a gallery level. You look down into the market from above." Victoria was quiet. He turned around. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before something had moved in her face, in the controlled, composed surface of it. She looked like someone who had been carrying something alone for a while, and had just unexpectedly found someone else holding part of the weight. "That's what I see," she said. Her voice was careful. "Exactly that. I've been trying to articulate it to my team for 2 months, and what comes out always sounds wrong, and you walked in here and said it in 4 minutes." "The building said it," James said. "I just listened." She finished the sentence without any quality of performance in it. "Yes." They were both quiet for a moment inside the building that remembered what it was for, and was waiting to find out what it could become. "Your board won't like it," James said. "Market halls don't pencil out the way residential towers do. The yield per square foot. I know the numbers." She walked across the floor toward the south wall, laid one hand flat against the boards covering the lower section of a window frame. "I've been in this business for 11 years. I know what the numbers say. I also know what happens when you optimize purely for the numbers." She turned to look at him. "You get things that are profitable and hollow. You get spaces that no one remembers existed 6 years after you build them. You get—" She stopped herself. "Safe work," James said. She looked at him. "Yes." The word sat between them with more weight than the building around them, because they both understood it wasn't just about buildings. It had never just been about buildings from the moment she'd first said that makes sense about a man who'd put down the work that scared him and picked up work he could control. James turned back to the space. He needed something to do with his hands, so he took out his phone and started photographing the column connections, the mezzanine structure, the slab thickness, where it was exposed at a crack in the floor. Victoria watched him work without interrupting. That was rare. He was beginning to understand. Most people filled silence. She understood the value of letting a person think. After 20 minutes, he put his phone away. "I want to see the upper floors. 3rd floor has some water intrusion at the north corner. Roof drain backed up at some point. The timber in that corner needs assessment." "How bad?" "Come see." The 3rd floor was where it got complicated. Not structurally, the water damage was real, but limited a 12-foot section of the north corner where a roof drain had failed and let water sit against the timber for a season or 2. Bad, but not catastrophic. Repairable. The rest of the floor was the same clean bones as below. What was complicated was that they'd been up there 20 minutes moving through the space with James calling out observations, and Victoria answering them with the precision of someone who had already done her homework, down to the subsurface level. When James stopped at the north window, the board here had come loose on one side and stood looking out at the city. She came to stand beside him, not close, just in the same field of view. They stood there looking out through the gap in the board at the south side of Chicago, the stacked roof lines, the water tower 3 blocks east, the elevated track visible in the middle distance. "Can I ask you something?" James said. It wasn't really a question. "Yes. Why me specifically? For this?" He turned to look at her, and because they were standing closer than they'd been downstairs, and the space was smaller up here, there was nowhere to look except directly at each other. "There are 100 architects in this city who could walk this building with you. Firms with the adaptive reuse portfolio, the track record, the board presentation experience. Why a guy you met at a wedding 11 days ago?" Victoria held his gaze. She didn't look away from direct questions. He'd noticed this. It was one of those rare qualities that felt both entirely natural and slightly startling every time. "Because of what you said at the wedding." "I said a lot of things. You said your son was the reason you came." She said it simply, directly. "Not Claire. Not obligation. You said he's the reason I came. And then you walked back toward him through all those people, and the way you moved, you went straight to him, James. Like a compass finding north." She paused. "A man who moves like that when it comes to his kid, who has that in him, that kind of clear, he's going to look at a building the same way. Straight to the thing that matters." He stood there and let that land. "Also," Victoria added, and the ghost of that small real smile was at the corner of her mouth. You were the only person at that wedding who looked at the lake instead of the party. And that's relevant. Someone who looks at the lake instead of the party isn't interested in what everyone else is doing. They're interested in what they actually think. She looked back out through the gap in the board. Those are the only people worth working with. James looked at her profile, the line of her jaw, the way she stood very still when she was thinking, the way she looked at the city, the way she looked at buildings and people, like she was actually trying to understand what was there rather than what she expected to find. He thought about the last 3 years, the controllable work, the safe shape of his days. The mornings at the kitchen window looking at a garden bed he hadn't planted because starting it felt like a decision. My partner Leon, he said. Leon Dean. He's been trying to get a meeting with your firm for 2 years. Victoria glanced at him with something that might have been amusement. I know Leon's work. He's good. Tell him to have someone reach out through proper channels. What are proper channels for your firm? Submit a project portfolio with a specific adaptive reuse project and a written design philosophy statement. Not a pitch. A statement what you actually believe about how buildings relate to the communities around them. She paused. Most firms send pitches. They don't get a response. The ones who send a statement of belief, I read those. James nodded slowly. I'll tell him. You could also just work on this with us. She said it carefully, watching him. Not a full firm engagement. Just consulting. You and me thinking through what this building wants to be and how to make the case for it to the people who control the money. She paused. No commitment beyond that. If it goes nowhere, it goes nowhere. He looked at her. You're asking me to join your fight with your board. I'm asking you to help me build the argument. Yes. Because the building told you to. That small, real smile again. Because you walked in here and said Market Hall in 4 minutes, and that's what I've been trying to say for 2 months. She held his gaze steadily. Also because, and I recognize this is not a professional reason, I find it easier to think clearly when you're in the room, which is a thing I haven't been able to say about another person in a very long time. James felt the lock in his chest move again. Not open, it didn't open all at once. But it moved with more intention this time, a full turn, rather than the faint shift of 3 weeks ago. He looked away from her back at the city through the gap in the board. He breathed in. He let it out. I have a son who I need to be home for by 6, he said. I have a business partner I need to keep employed. I have a zoning review on a north side project that needs my full attention for the next 3 weeks. He turned back to her. I also have a fence I just fixed, and a garden bed I haven't planted yet, and I'm starting to think not planting it is the thing I need to stop doing. Victoria looked at him. She was listening, really listening, not just waiting for the end of the sentence. I'll consult on the building, he said. On terms we agree to. Clean contract, Leon's included in the conversation, nothing under the table. He paused. And I want full access to the structural documentation, the title history, the previous remediation assessments, everything you have. I'll send it Monday, and I want to bring Danny to see it, at some point, when the timing makes sense. He wasn't sure why he said this last part. He'd said it before he'd understood that he needed to. He should see what his father is working on. He should see work that isn't just work. Victoria's expression shifted in that way that changed her whole face, not the professional composure, not the controlled steadiness, but something underneath it. Something that had been living quietly behind the other things. I'd like that, she said. She said it with the care of someone who understood exactly what was being offered and was not taking it lightly. They stood there a moment longer in the third-floor light, the city spread out through the gap in the boards, the building around them solid and patient and full of everything it still had to offer. Then James's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Dad. When are you coming home? I made dinner. A pause between texts, then I made cereal, but I put it in a bowl so it counts. James looked at the text for a moment. Then he looked up at Victoria, who was watching him with those dark eyes, and said, I need to go. I know. Monday, send me everything. It'll be in your inbox before 8. He put his phone away. He took one more look at the space, the beam connections, the mezzanine edge, the south windows that would flood this whole floor with light when the boards came off, and then he turned and walked toward the stairwell. He stopped at the top of the stairs, turned back. Victoria. She was still at the window. She turned. You said you find it easier to think clearly when I'm in the room. He held her gaze. Same, for the record. He said it the way she said hard things, direct, no preamble, no softening. And then he went down the stairs and out through the building into the afternoon light. He sat in his truck for a moment before he started it. He thought about Leon, who was going to have a great deal to say on Monday morning. He thought about the documentation Victoria would send, the title history, the remediation assessments, the bones of a building that had been waiting 9 years for someone to take it seriously. He thought about Danny at home with cereal in a bowl. He started the truck. He didn't think about the safe work. He didn't think about the controllable shape of his days. He thought about a market hall flooded with afternoon light and an artisan floor and a mezzanine gallery looking down into it, and the specific feeling of a building telling you what it needed to become if only someone would listen. He thought about the way Victoria Hart had said, I find it easier to think clearly when you're in the room, and the way it had felt to hear it like a frequency he'd forgotten he was capable of receiving suddenly coming in clear. He pulled out onto the brick-paved street and drove north toward home. The garden bed was going to need soil amendment before anything could grow in it. He'd need to check what Kate had planted there originally, what the sun exposure was, what made sense for the zone. He could figure that out. He could look it up the way he'd figured out the pipe under the bathroom sink, the way he'd figured out the fence latch. He could start. The documentation arrived at 7:47 a.m. on Monday, 13 minutes before Victoria had said it would. James was already at his desk with his second coffee when the email came through. No greeting, no preamble, just a subject line that read, Harmon Building, full package, and 11 attachments, organized by category structural surveys, title chain, environmental assessments, previous development proposals, zoning history, utility, infrastructure maps, and a single file labeled simply, My Notes. That was 43 pages long and written in a voice that was nothing like the composed professional surface she showed the world. It was direct questioning, sometimes blunt to the point of being argumentative with herself. This doesn't work, and I know it doesn't work. So why do I keep coming back to it and reading it? Felt like being handed something private which he understood it was. He read everything before Leon arrived at 9. Leon walked in, poured his coffee, sat across from James's desk, and looked at the open files on the screen. He said nothing for a moment. Then, that's the Harmon Building. You know it. I know the address. I drove past it 2 years ago when I was scoping the south side for a different project. He leaned forward, looked at the structural survey on the screen. The bones on that thing are extraordinary, James said. Yeah. Leon looked at him. Yeah, they are. A pause. She sent you all of this? Everything. Leon sat back, looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the way he did when he was organizing his thoughts into an order that wouldn't start a fight. I want to say something, and I want you to hear it as coming from someone who has been your partner for 6 years and your friend for 8, and who is saying it because he means it and not because he's doing the Pete thing. Say it. She trusts you. Leon said it simply. 43 pages of private notes and 11 files of proprietary development data. She sent that to a man she's known for 3 weeks. That's not a professional calculation. That's... He paused. That's trust, James. That's something she decided about you before she could have enough evidence to be certain. James looked at the screen. People make professional judgments. Not like this. Leon shook his head. I've been in this business 20 years. People don't send their private notes. They send the polished version. They send what they want you to see. He looked directly at James. She sent you what she actually thinks. James didn't answer right away. He looked at the file labeled, My Notes, still open on his screen, at the line he'd read 3 times that morning. The building survived because it was built for something real. I want to know if we're still capable of building for something real, or if that's just a thing we tell ourselves. We're consulting, James said finally. Formally. Leon, I want you involved, full design team capacity. Contract terms, proper engagement, nothing informal. Leon looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Okay. Another pause. I'll reach out to her office today about the contract. She said to submit through proper channels, portfolio, and a design philosophy statement. Leon almost smiled. Of course she did. He stood, picked up his coffee, stopped at the door. James? Yeah. Plant the garden. James looked at him. Whatever's going on, plant the thing. Leon shrugged. That's all I'm saying. He walked out. James turned back to the screen. He opened a new file and started writing. Judge. The first working meeting was the following Wednesday at Hart Capital Ventures offices on Michigan Avenue, glass and steel, and the kind of curated minimalism that money produces when it's trying to look like it isn't trying. The conference room had a view of the lake that would have distracted James if he hadn't trained himself long ago to focus through beautiful things. Victoria's team was 5 people. Her project director, a woman named Sylvia, who had the focused energy of someone running on purpose and caffeine in equal measure. 2 junior analysts. A structural engineer named Warren, who turned out to have opinions about cast iron construction that matched James's own so precisely that they spent 8 minutes talking directly to each other while everyone else at the table waited. And then Marcus Webb, Victoria's chief financial officer, 50-something, silver-haired, with the particular expression of a man who had sat in 100 of these meetings and had learned to identify immediately which ones were going to cost him money he didn't think was worth spending. Webb looked at James's preliminary concept sketches: market hall ground floor, workshop studios, upper floors, mezzanine gallery, and said without hostility, but without softening either, the yield on this configuration is 40% below what a standard residential tower produces on that footprint. I know, James said. Then you understand why the board. The board is optimizing for one metric, James said. He kept his voice level, the way he'd kept his voice level in briefing rooms on ships when he was 29, and the senior officers across the table had twice his age and half his information. Yield per square foot over a 5-year horizon. I understand that metric. I'm asking you to consider a different set of metrics over a longer horizon. Webb looked at him. Such as community anchor value. A market hall of this scale in this neighborhood becomes the thing that raises surrounding property values over a 10-year window. It creates foot traffic that supports retail on adjacent blocks. It generates the kind of neighborhood identity that makes residential development on the surrounding parcels more valuable, not less. James slid a page across the table. He'd put the numbers together over the weekend, working from comparable adaptive reuse projects in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Detroit. These are comps, not perfect, but directional. In every case, the community anchor development produced better total neighborhood ROI than the isolated residential tower, even accounting for the lower initial yield. Webb picked up the page, looked at it, put it down. These are different markets. They're comparable markets: mid-century industrial corridor, post-manufacturing South Side geography, similar demographic composition. James leaned forward slightly. Chicago isn't Cleveland, but the structural economics of what happens when you put something real in a neighborhood that's been written off are consistent. Sylvia was nodding. The 2 junior analysts were looking at the comp sheet like they wanted to photograph it. Warren was still thinking about cast iron. Webb looked across the table at Victoria, who had been sitting at the head of the table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, watching James make the case she'd been trying to make for 2 months, and said, "Where did you find this guy?" Victoria said, "He found himself." It was such an unexpected answer that the room went quiet for a beat. Then Sylvia laughed a short, genuine laugh, and something in the atmosphere of the conference room shifted. Not decided, not resolved, but shifted. Webb looked at the comp sheet again, then at James. "I want a full financial model. Your assumptions documented your comps, documented a sensitivity analysis on the yield differential across 3 development scenarios. I'll have it in 2 weeks, James said. 1 week, Webb said. If you want board time before the Q4 calendar locks. James looked at him. 1 week. Webb nodded, stood, picked up his materials, looked at Victoria on his way out. He's better than the last 3 architects you brought in, he said, which from Webb was clearly the equivalent of a standing ovation. When the room had cleared to just James, Victoria, and Sylvia, who was packing up her laptop with the focused efficiency of someone who had 17 other things to do, Victoria looked at James and said, "You didn't tell me you were going to bring comps. You didn't ask. I assumed you'd do the building argument, the emotional case." She tilted her head slightly. "You did the financial case. You need both," James said. "The building argument convinces people who already want to be convinced. The financial case convinces people who don't." He paused. "I spent 12 years in the Navy learning to brief people who needed the data first and the vision second. It's a different order than architects usually work in." She looked at him with that expression he was starting to recognize, the one where something moved in the composed surface of her face, the controlled steadiness giving way briefly to something underneath it. 1 week on the financial model, she said. That's a significant commitment. I know. Leon's team. Full capacity. We'll get there. Sylvia, without looking up from her laptop, said, I'll send you our internal assumptions by end of day. Don't use them directly, but they'll save you from having to rebuild the baseline. She closed her laptop, stood, gave James a look of compact professional approval, and walked out. Victoria and James were alone in the conference room, with the lake visible through the glass behind her. You didn't have to do the financial model, she said. I didn't ask you for that. No. James agreed. You asked me what the building wanted to be. I told you. Now I'm helping you make the case. He looked at her steadily. That's what you do when you believe in something. You don't just say you believe in it. You do the work. She looked at him for a long moment. The lake was very still in the glass behind her. You're going to make this harder, she said quietly. He frowned. The board presentation. No. She held his gaze. This. She didn't gesture at anything specific, which meant she was gesturing at everything. All of it. He understood what she meant. He understood it the way you understand something that you've known for a while was coming, but hadn't let yourself name. He didn't rush at it or back away from it. He just let it sit there in the room between them, honest and real, and not going anywhere. I know, he said. She nodded once, picked up her portfolio, paused. Danny, she said, you mentioned bringing him to see the building. When the timing's right. This Saturday I'm doing another walkthrough. I want to check the progress on the North Corner water assessment. She held his gaze carefully. If Danny wanted to see a building full of old cast iron columns, Saturday at 10 would be a reasonable time. James felt the thing that happened in his chest now, with increasing frequency. Not painful, not sharp. Just the movement of something long still beginning to find its range of motion. I'll ask him, he said. Tell him the building used to make fabric, Victoria said. I find that tends to interest 8-year-olds more than structural assessments. You don't know many 8-year-olds. No, she said. But I know Danny is interested in things that survived doing something useful. A small pause. The building survived. It's still standing after 9 years of no one caring about it. He might like that. James looked at her. How do you know that about him? You've never met him. You told me, she said simply. At the wedding. The way you described him, the penguin theory, the sharks looking for things that are wise or unbothered. She held his gaze. A kid who thinks like that is interested in survivors. He stood there and let her be right, because she was right. And because there was something about being accurately seen, not flattered, not managed, actually seen, that still surprised him, even when it came from this woman who had been doing it since the first night. Saturday, he said. 10 o'clock. He told Danny that night at dinner, in the same straightforward way he told Danny most things, no setup, no cushioning, just the fact. You want to come see a building Saturday morning? Danny looked up from his plate. What kind of building? Old industrial, mid-century, cast iron columns, timber beams 4 stories. It used to make fabric. Danny considered. Is it abandoned? It has been. We're figuring out what to do with it. We, who? Me and a woman I'm working with. Victoria. He said her name the same way he said any other word, careful not to add weight to it or remove it. She's a developer. She found the building. I'm helping design what it becomes. Danny ate for a moment in silence. Then carefully, is she the green dress lady? Yes. Another silence. Eating. Is she nice? James thought about 43 pages of private notes. He thought about, I find it easier to think clearly when you're in the room. He thought about the way she'd said the building survived and the accuracy with which she'd predicted that this would matter to his son. She's honest, he said, which is better than nice. Danny looked at him with the serious recognition of someone being handed back their own words. Then he nodded with great gravity. Okay, he said. I'll come. You don't have to. I want to see the cast iron columns. He said it like this was obvious. And I want to see if she's really honest, or if you're just saying that. James looked at his 8-year-old. You're going to like her, he said, before he could stop himself. Danny smiled Kate's smile, the whole face involved, and went back to his dinner. Saturday at 10, the 3 of them stood in front of the Harmon building. Danny had his hands in his jacket pockets and his head tilted back, looking up at the facade with the methodical attention he gave to anything that interested him. The same look he gave to YouTube videos about deep-sea creatures, to the structural section in the library book about bridges, to the underside of the kitchen table, when he was convinced there was something interesting about how it was built. It's big, he said. 4 stories, Victoria said. She was standing beside him, matching his angle of view, looking at the building the way he was looking at it. The people who built this knew it was going to need to do serious work, so they didn't cut corners. Danny pointed at the cast iron detail, at the corner column, visible through the grime. Is that original? Both James and Victoria turned to look at him. Yes, Victoria said. How did you know to ask that? Dad's been looking at the photos all week. The columns are the thing he keeps going back to. Danny glanced at his father. When you keep going back to something, it means it's the most important part. Victoria looked at James. James said nothing because there was nothing useful he could add to that. They went inside. Danny walked with his hands at his sides, not touching anything yet. Just looking, processing the scale of it, the ceiling height, the mezzanine, the south windows still boarded. He walked to the center of the ground floor and stood there for a moment, looking up at the timber beams, the way he looked at the ceiling of the Natural History Museum. It's like a cathedral, he said quietly, except it's for making things instead of praying. Victoria stood very still. James heard something in her exhale, barely a sound, just the smallest release of air, the kind of sound a person makes when someone says exactly the thing they'd been trying to say. Yes, she said. That's exactly what it is. Danny walked to one of the iron columns and put both hands around it. Couldn't reach around, the column was too broad, but he laid his palms flat against it, the same way James had on the first walkthrough. He looked up to where it met the beam. How long has it been empty? He asked. 9 years, Victoria said. That's longer than I've been alive. He considered this. Then, did it know someone would come eventually? Victoria crouched down, which put her at his eye level, a thing she did without making it feel condescending, without the exaggerated friendliness that adults sometimes performed for children. She just came down to where he was and looked at him straight. I think buildings like this one hold on, she said, because they were built well and they know it, and they're patient. She paused. Does that sound silly? Danny shook his head seriously. That sounds like the penguins. he said. Victoria looked at him. "Tell me about the penguins." And Danny explained the penguin theory, the only birds that can't fly but don't seem to mind, which makes them either wise or unbothered, in the full and careful version that James had never gotten, because Danny had been waiting for the right audience and had apparently decided that Victoria Hart crouching at eye level beside an iron column in a 9-year empty building was that audience. When he finished, Victoria said, "I think the building is like the penguins. It couldn't do the thing it was supposed to do anymore, make fabric-run machines do the original job. But it didn't collapse. It just waited." Danny nodded. "Wise or unbothered," he said. "Both, maybe," Victoria said. She stood back up. Danny went off toward the mezzanine stairs. James had told him he could go up with supervision, and Victoria had confirmed the stairs were sound. James watched his son climb carefully, one hand on the rail, looking at everything. Then he looked at Victoria. She was watching Danny climb the stairs with an expression that she hadn't composed, hadn't arranged, just the pure, unguarded version of her face, and what was on it was something that had been behind the stillness and the precision and the 43 pages of private notes about a building that deserved better. Something she'd been keeping carefully back. "He's extraordinary," she said. Her voice was quiet, meant only for James. "I know," James said. "He's been like that since he was 4. Kate used to say he came into the world already thinking." He paused. "She would have—" He stopped. Victoria looked at him. She didn't finish the sentence for him. She just waited in the particular patient way of hers that wasn't passive. It was active. It was present. It was the most complete form of listening he'd encountered in a person since Kate herself. "She would have liked you," he said. He hadn't planned to say it, but it was true, and true things had a way of coming out of him in this woman's presence, the same way the building had come out of him in 4 minutes on the first walkthrough. Kate. She had good radar for people who were real. She didn't have much patience for anything else. Victoria looked at him steadily. Her eyes were bright, and he understood she was holding something carefully, the way you hold something you don't want to break. "I'm glad she knew you," Victoria said. "And I'm glad he has you." From above them, Danny called down from the mezzanine. "Dad, Dad, you can see the whole floor from up here. You can see everything." James looked up. His son was at the mezzanine railing looking down at them both, small, certain, happy in the specific way he was happy when something matched the idea he'd had of it. James raised his hand. "I see you, buddy." "Come up," Danny called. "Victoria, come up. You have to see it from here." James looked at Victoria. She looked at James. She was smiling, the real one, the full one, not the corner of the mouth version, but the one that changed her whole face and had been living quietly behind everything else. It was the first time he'd seen it at full strength, and it was something. It landed in him the way the first real thing lands after a long absence of real things. "Come on," he said. They went up together. At the top, Danny was right. From the mezzanine, you could see the whole ground floor, the column grid, the full south wall of boarded windows, the breadth of the space below, the way the light would pour through when those boards came down. You could see exactly what it was going to be. Danny stood between them at the railing, not touching either of them. Just present the three of them looking down at a building that had been patient for 9 years and was finally being asked what it wanted to become. It was not a family. It was 3 people at a railing in an empty building on a Saturday morning. But it was something. It was the beginning of something. And James Calloway, who had stood at the edge of his sister's wedding and calculated the exit, who had watched other people live the life he used to have and felt invisible inside. All of it stood at that railing and did not look for the door. He stood there. He stayed. He let himself be in it. The financial model took 6 days instead of 7. James worked on it the way he used to work on ship deployment plans in the Navy, with full attention. No shortcuts, every assumption documented and sourced, every variable stress tested against 3 different scenarios. Leon's team ran the numbers twice, and then Leon ran them again himself, because Leon was the kind of man who trusted his team completely, and then verified their work anyway, not from distrust, but from the understanding that the things worth building were worth building correctly. When James sent the completed model to Victoria at 11:47 p.m. on Thursday night, he included a single line of text above the attachment, "It holds." Even in the conservative scenario, the neighborhood ROI argument is solid. Webb will push back on assumptions 3 and 7. I've documented the defense for both. Her response came at 12:03 a.m. He was still awake. He'd told himself he was going to go to sleep after sending the model, but had not in fact done that, and his phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he looked at it in the dark. This is the best financial argument I've seen for a project I believed in without one. Thank you. Get some sleep. He put the phone down, looked at the ceiling. He was smiling. He didn't try to catch it this time. The board presentation was the following Tuesday at 8 a.m., and James had been in enough high-stakes briefings in his life to know the particular quality of the silence in a room where powerful people were deciding whether to trust someone. It was a specific silence, not empty, loaded, the kind that had texture and weight, and that a person either learned to stand inside of without flinching or spent their whole career trying to avoid. James had learned to stand inside it at 26 in a briefing room on a naval base outside San Diego, presenting a logistics plan to a room full of officers who'd all been in service longer than he'd been alive. He stood inside it now. Webb was there along with 4 other board members, 2 men who'd built their money in commercial real estate development and approached the presentation with the professional skepticism of people who had been told compelling stories before and knew how they usually ended, and 2 women, one of whom was Hart Capital's legal counsel, and one of whom James later learned had a background in urban planning, and who nodded a small, precise, single nod when he presented the community anchor argument and the 10-year neighborhood ROI projection. Victoria presented the vision. James presented the economics. Warren, the structural engineer, presented the technical feasibility assessment. Sylvia presented the project timeline and cost structure with the focused precision of someone who had done her homework and was confident in every number. Webb asked the questions James had predicted, assumptions 3 and 7 exactly as flagged. James answered them with the documented defense he'd prepared calmly, without over-explaining the way you answered questions from senior officers, complete, direct, no wasted words. The board member with the urban planning background asked a question James hadn't anticipated. What's the failure mode? If the market hall concept doesn't generate the anchor traffic you're projecting, what does the building become? James looked at her. He thought for a moment, not performing the thinking, actually thinking. The structural bones are adaptable, he said. The column grid and ceiling height that make it ideal for a market hall also make it ideal for creative office space, live work lofts, or a hybrid arts facility. We're not locked into a single use. The building is flexible because it was built flexible. The original manufacturers planned for reconfiguration. That's the asset we're protecting. He paused. The failure mode of this project is a building that becomes something different than we planned. The failure mode of the alternative demolition and a standard residential tower is that we've lost something we can never get back. The room was quiet. The urban planning board member looked at her notes. Then she looked at Victoria. Then she looked back at James. I want to see the structural documentation, she said. It's in the appendix, James said. Tab 4. She opened her folder to tab 4. 40 minutes later, the board voted. It wasn't unanimous. One of the commercial real estate developers abstained, which was his right, and also his way of registering skepticism without blocking progress. But the vote passed. The Harmon Building project was approved for development. When the room cleared, Victoria stood at the window with her back to him for a moment, looking out at the lake. He could see her breathing the controlled exhale of someone releasing 2 months of pressure. Then she turned around. Tab 4, she said. I organized the appendix Thursday night, after I sent you the model. At midnight. The work needed to be complete. She looked at him with the full steadiness of those dark eyes. You walked into a room full of people who control significant amounts of money and told them the failure mode of their preferred option was irreversibility. She tilted her head slightly. That was either very confident or very calculated. Both, James said. The Navy taught me that the strongest argument is the one that takes away their alternative. You don't just defend your position, you reframe what the other choice costs. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, James." He shook his head. "The building made the argument. We just organized it." She smiled, the full one, the real one, the one that had been behind everything else. "You keep saying that, about the building." "Because it's true." "I know," she said. "That's why I keep letting you say it." She picked up her portfolio, then paused. "Sylvia's setting up the project kickoff meeting for next week. Full team, your firm and mine. I want Leon in the room from the start." "He'll be there." James picked up his own folder. Then he stopped. "Victoria." She turned. He looked at her, and he was aware that they were standing in a boardroom that was now empty, and that the professional context that had organized the last several weeks was still present but had become thinner, more transparent, and that what was on the other side of it was something they'd both been navigating around with care and precision and had not yet named directly. He was a man who had spent 3 years being precise about what he would not allow himself to feel. He was also a man who had learned in 12 years of the Navy that there was a moment in any consequential situation where continuing to wait was not the same as being careful. It was just waiting. "After the kickoff," he said, "I want to take you to dinner. Not a meeting, not a walkthrough, dinner." He held her gaze steadily. "If you want that." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her processing it, not hesitating, not uncertain, but careful in the way she was careful with everything that mattered. "I want that," she said, quiet, direct, no hedge. He nodded once. "After the kickoff," he said. She walked out. James stood alone in the boardroom for a moment, with the lake behind the glass and the empty chairs around the table, and the feeling unfamiliar and specific of a man who had done something right, not just done it well, but done it right, which were not always the same thing, and both of which mattered. He picked up his folder. He went to find Leon. Leon, when told about the board approval, shook both fists in the air in the elevator on the way down, which was extremely out of character, and which James pretended not to see because Leon had a reputation to maintain, and James respected that. By the time the elevator doors opened, Leon was composed again. Jacket, straight expression, professional. "Full design team," Leon said as they crossed the lobby. "Full team," James confirmed. "I want Marcus on structural. He and Warren already speak the same language. I heard them at the meeting." "Done." "And I want—" Leon stopped walking, turned, looked at James with the careful attention of a man who had been watching his friend for 6 years and knew every variation of his face. "You're different," Leon said. "We won the board vote. Not that." Leon shook his head slowly. "You've been different for a few weeks, since—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "The fence," he said instead. "I fixed the fence." "You fixed the fence." "And—" James looked at him. "I'm going to plant the garden." Leon looked back at him for a long moment. A man who had been waiting with great patience to hear something like that. He nodded once, the way a person nods when the thing they hoped would happen has happened, and they want to acknowledge it without making it fragile by talking about it too much. "Good," Leon said. And then they walked out into the afternoon. He planted the garden on a Saturday in October, 3 weeks after the board vote. He'd spent 2 evenings reading about what grew well in Zone 5, what would come back the following spring, what Kate had originally intended for that bed. He'd found a note in her handwriting in the back of a gardening book on the shelf. A list of plants with small diagrams of where they'd go, which told him she'd planned it carefully, which was so entirely like her that reading it had stopped him for a full minute in the kitchen. He ordered what she'd listed. He added 2 things of his own. Danny helped. He was not a skilled gardener. He handled the trowel with the enthusiasm of someone who had no technique but abundant commitment, and he got dirt on his jacket within 4 minutes and didn't seem to notice. He asked questions continuously. Why did some plants go in front and some in back? What was the difference between annuals and perennials? Why did plants need to go in the ground before winter, if winter was going to kill them anyway? James answered the last one straight. "They're not going in to survive the winter," he said. "They're going in so they're ready when spring comes. The work happens underground while it's cold. You can't see it, but it's happening. And then when it's warm again, they come up." Danny thought about this, hands in the dirt. "Like how you've been different lately," he said. James looked at his son. "What? You've been different, since the wedding, like something was happening that I couldn't see." Danny looked up at him with his mother's eyes and his mother's radar. "Like the plants." James sat back on his heels in the dirt. He thought about standing at the edge of a reception, with his back to a party counting lights on the lake. He thought about a green dress and dark eyes, and a woman who'd said, "I think it would be a shame if we didn't say something true." He thought about a coffee shop at 6 a.m. and a building with 14-foot column spacing and 43 pages of private notes and a board vote, and the specific quality of a room when a woman he was beginning to love said, "I want that," with complete and unperformed honesty. He thought about the fence latch. He thought about the garden bed Kate had planned and never gotten to plant. He thought about Danny at the mezzanine railing calling down, "Come up. You have to see it from here." "Yeah," James said quietly, "like the plants." Danny nodded, satisfied, and went back to the trowel with full commitment and zero technique. They finished the garden in 2 hours. Danny went inside to wash up trailing dirt through the kitchen with spectacular efficiency. James stayed outside a moment looking at the bed, the turned soil, the planted things that wouldn't show themselves until spring, the work that was done even though you couldn't see it yet. He thought about Kate. He let himself think about her without the usual management of it, without the careful containment, the controlled distance. He thought about her handwriting in the gardening book. He thought about her planning this exact bed with her diagrams and her careful lists, the way she planned everything she cared about. He thought about the fact that she would have done this, would have knelt in this same dirt and put these same plants in, and it would have been the most natural thing in the world. He thought about the fact that she was gone, and the garden was still here waiting to be planted. He pressed his palm flat against the turned earth, the same gesture he'd made against the iron column in the Harmon building. The same instinct to touch the thing and know it was real and solid and still standing. "I'm okay," he said. Not to anyone, not to the air. He said it because it was true, and because true things deserve to be said out loud, and because he had spent 3 years saying "I'm fine" when he wasn't, and he was done with that. He was not fine yet in all the ways, but he was okay. He was actually genuinely okay, and that was something he hadn't been able to say honestly since a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago when his phone had rung and the number was the hospital, and the world had reorganized itself permanently around an absence. He was okay. He was working on something real. His son was inside the house tracking dirt through the kitchen and asking questions that didn't have clean answers. And there was a woman who looked at him like she was actually interested in what she found. And there was a building in the south side of Chicago that had been patient for 9 years and was finally being asked what it wanted to become. He was okay. He stood up. He went inside. Dinner was a Thursday 2 weeks after the project kickoff at a restaurant in the West Loop that Victoria had chosen, and that turned out to be small, unhurried, and lit in a way that made conversation feel like the point rather than the backdrop. No agenda, no portfolio, no floor plans or financial models or structural assessments. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about things that had nothing to do with buildings or that had everything to do with them, depending on how you understood the way people and places were connected. She told him about growing up in a family that moved every 2 years, the daughter of a diplomat, which meant she'd learned very young to read a new place quickly and find the thing that made it real. He told her about the Navy, the way long deployments changed your relationship with time and home, the way coming back was sometimes harder than leaving. She told him about the year after her fiancé died, the one where she'd worked 18 hours a day, and thought she was coping and later understood she'd been hiding. He told her about the first Christmas after Kate, which he'd gotten through by focusing exclusively on Danny, and had not fully felt until February alone at his desk at 2 in the morning, when it had hit him all at once. She didn't say "I know how that feels" in the automatic way people said it. She said, "February. Yes, that tracks." Like it was data she recognized. Like they were two people comparing field notes from the same difficult territory. When the check came, they argued about it briefly. Victoria moved for it first. James caught it. She gave him a look of mild but genuine displeasure. He said, "I asked you to dinner." She said, "I'm a billionaire." He said, "I'm aware of that. It's irrelevant." And she laughed, the full one, unguarded, the one that changed her whole face, and conceded. Outside on the sidewalk, the October air had real cold in it now, the kind that came in off the lake and meant what it said. They stood for a moment outside the restaurant, not in any hurry, both of them aware that the evening was ending and neither of them moving toward that. "Danny asked me something this morning," James said. "Tell me." "He asked if you liked penguins." Victoria looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know." He said. James paused, because what Danny had actually said was too precise not to quote directly. He said, "You should find out. It matters what a person thinks about penguins." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then, "I love penguins. Because they can't fly. Because they went ahead anyway." She met his eyes. "They couldn't do the thing birds were supposed to do, so they did something else, completely, without apology." She paused. I find that very compelling." James looked at her on the sidewalk in the October cold, with the city moving around them, the way cities moved, indifferent to any particular moment in it all. The millions of individual things happening simultaneously. Life on all scales. And he thought about a lock that had first moved at 40 miles an hour on a dark highway a few months ago, and that had been moving steadily, deliberately, honestly since then, and he thought about what it meant to go ahead anyway. He reached out and took her hand. Not a gesture, not a move, just a decision made the way he made the decisions that mattered, without theater, without excess. Her hand was cold from the air. She looked down at their hands, then up at him, and her expression was the most open he'd ever seen it. The composed professional surface gone entirely, and what was underneath it was someone who had been careful and controlled and alone for a very long time, and who was right now choosing not to be. "I'm not all the way back," he said. He needed to say it. He said most true things when he needed to. "From where I've been, I don't want to pretend I'm something I haven't finished becoming yet." "I know," she said. "Neither am I." "This is going to be complicated," she said. "Layered. Real." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not interested in easy, James. Easy doesn't build anything." He looked at her. He thought about a building that had waited 9 years for someone to ask the right question. He thought about soil turned in October that wouldn't show anything until spring. He thought about a kid who'd looked at the only birds that couldn't fly and decided to figure out whether they were wise or unbothered before he made up his mind. He thought about standing at the edge of a wedding he didn't want to attend, watching people live the life he used to have ready to leave, and a woman in a green dress who came over and said something true and changed the whole direction of the night. "No," he said. "Easy doesn't build anything." He held her hand on the sidewalk in the cold, and they stood there in the city that moved around them and didn't care, and that was fine. They didn't need it to care. They had what they had, two people who had lost things they couldn't replace, and had learned through those losses the difference between a life that was managed and a life that was lived, and who were standing at the beginning of something that was going to ask them both to be brave in ways they hadn't been in a long time. James Calloway had come to his sister's wedding alone, a man who'd made peace with the idea that the best parts of his life were behind him, and that getting through each day was enough. He had been wrong about that. Not wrong the way a person is wrong about a fact, wrong the way a person is wrong about what's possible. The difference between those two kinds of wrong was everything. He drove home that night with the city lights behind him and the heater running and the radio low. And when he got home, Danny was asleep in his bed with the stuffed penguin he didn't admit to owning. And James stood in the doorway of his son's room for a moment in the dark, listening to him breathe, and felt the full weight of how much he loved this kid, the specific, enormous daily weight of it that he carried everywhere, and that was the realest thing in his life and always had been. He went to his own room. He didn't lie awake staring at the ceiling. He lay down and closed his eyes and thought briefly about a building that was going to become a market hall, about a financial model that had held even in the conservative scenario, about a woman who said, "Easy doesn't build anything," with the certainty of someone who had earned the belief about a garden that was doing its work underground where nobody could see it. He thought about all the things that had been moving in the dark, getting ready for spring. And James Calloway, who had arrived at a wedding hollow and alone, and ready to leave, who had spent 3 years keeping the door bolted against anything that could surprise him, who had stood at the edge of the water, watching other people live, while he only endured. James Calloway closed his eyes and slept. Not because everything was healed, not because grief had a finish line or loss had a cure, or the missing of Kate was something that would ever fully resolve itself into something clean, but because he was building something real again, because his son was asleep in the next room with a penguin and a theory about wisdom, because there was soil turned in the backyard with things planted in it that would come up in spring, because somewhere on the south side of Chicago, a 4-story cast-iron building was finally, after 9 years, being asked what it wanted to become, and the answer was magnificent. Because a woman in a green dress had walked across a wedding reception and said something true, and he had stayed to hear it. He had stayed. That was the whole of it in the end. That was the thing that changed everything. He stayed.